Hello, welcome to Breaking the Spell. On today's show, we have our wonderful guest, Mohamed Imran Mohamed Taib, who is the one of the founding members and the board members of the Center for Interfaith Understanding, Singapore, or CIFU in short. So, Imran, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's a privilege having you here.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here in this program.
So for today's show, we'll be discussing issues related to religion and philosophy, or interfaith as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think for all our guests, we begin with this first question. If you can recall a moment in your past where you had this first experience where you felt that things weren't the way they should have been.
Interesting question. It takes a long time to actually tell my own biographical history, but in short, I would say that in my early years, when I was quite young, I had a more fundamentalist outlook of the world, in the sense that it's quite typical of someone who grew up in a culturally religious environment. Now, what do I mean by culturally religious? In the sense that religion is something that is part and parcel of everyday life, but it's not seen or channeled through an ideological lens. It's just part of family and communal practice, right? But there is that thing in me of wanting to make sense of the world. I mean, that's quite common as you grow up, in your growing up phase as a teenager, and making sense of the issues that are happening around you. Because I grew up in the period of the 80s to the 90s, and a lot of things were happening at the global front. The Bosnian War is one. Of course, there was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and of course the Palestinian issue. So, being a Muslim, these political issues at the global front, of course, created a lot of question marks. What does it mean to be a Muslim in this kind of modern and globalized world? And the kind of Islam that we grew up in, and the one that I was familiar with from a family setting, it's something that does not question what does it mean to be a Muslim. The identity issue wasn't really there in a traditional understanding of religion, right? But eventually, when you are confronted with this kind of global issues and the fact that Muslims are connected throughout the world, what does this identity of being a Muslim means? So that led me to explore my identity as a Muslim, and I began to think about Islam in a more ideological sense. Like, oh, okay, this identity is something that I have to actively choose. It's not simply you're born into the faith and you just go along with it. You have to actively assert your Islamic identity. And that was the mode of religiosity that colored my perspectives in my early years. I would say it's quite fundamentalist, in the sense that you come with this idea of the superiority of who you are and the community that you belong to. Of course, now I would think that it was part and parcel of a reaction to something bigger that was happening in that period where I grew up. But at that point in time, I really have this idea that my religion is the superior religion, and therefore it puts me on a path of wanting to proselytize and to find faults with other religions, to show their shortcomings in order to assert my own superiority in my faith. Actually, now I realize it's got a lot to do with this sense of uncertainty that requires confirmation by proclaiming your religion loudly so that you feel secure in this environment where the world is changing very fast. There's a lot of anxiety of the future. So a lot of things were happening, yeah. But of course, there were few incidents that led me to rethink this mode of religiosity and the way I think about religion and the way I relate to the world and to things around me, to friends, people of other faiths even. And slowly it shifted my worldview and my perspectives to something else. And of course, in short, now I'm an advocate of interfaith work. I believe in the need to embrace the positive side of diversity, and diversity is the basis of the strength in which humanity need to develop human civilization as a whole. So in short, that's where I am now. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, regarding the interfaith work, like where does it stand now for you? Do you find it's a very lonely position, or do you think your perspectives are actually quite welcome in the different groups that you work with?
Well, it really depends on how you define interfaith. Of course, different people will have a different understanding or even definition of what interfaith is all about. On one spectrum, you would have people who said interfaith is simply about living together harmoniously, coexisting peacefully, and therefore it requires you to be friendly and kind to your neighbors, to people around you, with the kind of, I would say, a utilitarian approach. I need to establish peace so that my own interests will be protected. So I will also feel safe. I will not feel safe if the neighbors are not peaceful with each other. It will affect me also. So it's a kind of utilitarian idea that we need to work together in order to secure everyone's interest, right? So that's on one hand, that's one way of understanding interfaith, to establish communal harmony and in social relations. But I think, to me, interfaith goes deeper than that. It's not simply about coexisting peacefully, but it requires an active search for the deeper sense of what it means to be human. Now, this is a bit philosophical in the sense that there is a certain tendency in the human to seek something that is much more transcendental, something that is beyond just the pure material conditions of the world, beyond the individual, to make sense and meaning. Why is there something rather than nothing? Yeah, and all that points to this whole idea of homo religiousness. That the human being is always in a constant search for meaning and making sense of the cosmos and things around us. So that actually allows you to open the doors for you to have a deep conversation with another fellow human being. And that can actually enrich your perspective beyond just simply the identity that you are familiar with, the traditions that you're familiar with. It transcends your own tradition. It opens up the door for you to actually explore other traditions and to find the richness in other traditions that can add on to the richness of your own sense of being. That kind of interfaith is slightly of a higher order. It requires deep engagement. It requires actually critical self-examination too. It's not simply I have to be kind to my neighbors, but what does it mean to be kind to each other? It's beyond simply my religion tells me to be kind. But I think kindness itself is something that is intrinsic maybe to the human being, or maybe it's not. It's something that is learned, or it's something that becomes a habit, if you are in that ecology that supports kindness. But that's something to have a discussion about. Because at the end of the day, what is religion? Other than human construction to guide towards the pursuit of meaning and to establish ways of life and living that is contextualized to the conditions of where you are, and the community you belong to. So there is that other element of interfaith. But I think the bottom line is, for anyone to be engaging in interfaith, it requires the humility to say that you don't know everything, and therefore you have this sense of incompleteness. That is why it's at odds with fundamentalism. Fundamentalism means that you have the absolute truth. There's nothing else beyond what you have already known, what you have assumed to be, of God, of the creation of the world and everything else, and there's no more questions to be asked, it's just about imposing it on other people to believe the way you believe. But interfaith is about humility, to say that you don't know something and you want to explore, and it requires an openness, not just humility but an openness. It requires charity also, of deep listening and developing empathy of how another person think about the world and how they relate to the world, and maybe that might actually point to certain blind spots that you might have, or things that you have not thought about, and it can actually enrich your own traditions even. In fact, if you look at all the world religions, they actually have a lot of synergy with each other in the past, right? They've borrowed from each other, and they have adopted many aspects from different civilizational achievements, and they have evolved to what it is today, and they will continue to evolve. So these are conversations that are possible only if you are willing to enter into that space with courage to discuss these issues within an interfaith setting. So I'm not sure whether I've confused you more than answering your question, but I believe that interfaith is not just pleasantries.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm actually curious whether you see your work with interfaith as also building bridges between religion and secularism. Because when you talk about the deeper level being this search for meaning, it often strikes me that one of the stark differences that people might think is that all religions have something common with each other, in that there is this explicit search for meaning, whereas like a lot of people feel secularism leaves this vacuum of meaning.
Your question is whether it's about building bridges between different religious communities and also an engagement with the secular world that we are living in.
Yeah.
Definitely, the building of bridges between religions, that is one of the basic of interfaith. Yeah. But I would put a caveat here and provide a bit more nuance. What does it mean to have a dialogue of religions? Firstly, we have to understand that the term religion can be problematic. Yeah. Of course, without going into the full academic treatment of the definition of religion and all its difficulties surrounding that term, we do know that religion is not something that is monolithic, even within a religious community. I mean, you look at Christianity, for example, so much divisions, sects, and schisms, right? Of course, you have the main divide between the Catholics and the Protestants, but even within the Protestants, you have Anglicans, Methodists, and all this kind of diversities. Similarly, all other religions, Buddhism, you have the different traditions, Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, and etc. Islam also, Sunni Shia, and even that also, in terms of their jurisprudence, is so much divided along the methodology that they use, the way to interpret certain things and all that. So we must move away from this idea that there can be a dialogue between two religions. That's the number one problematizing that I will put here. The second problematizing is who gets to represent the religion to say that now, because religion can't have dialogue with each other. They are represented through people who represents the religion, right? Or speaks on behalf of the religion. And that can be problematized. Who gets to speak on behalf of a religion to say that I am speaking on behalf of Islam with, let's say, Santosh. I'm just assuming, I don't know how you identify yourself, but let's say if you are a Buddhist, for example, can you say that you represent Buddhism, having this dialogue with Islam that with Imran that represents Islam? Definitely, for the 2 billion Muslims around the world, they would say, who is this Imran to represent an entire tradition that is so much diversity? So that is the second aspect of how I would problematize that question. So it's individuals who do the dialogue, and individuals have to understand their own biographical history. I mean, I will speak as an interlocutor for Islam based on my own experience as a Muslim, with my own knowledge that I've acquired or knowledge that I have not acquired that forms my blind spot, with my own context of how I understand Islam through what source, through what kind of experiences that I have. All this needs to be uncovered in a dialogue process. Otherwise, it becomes very formalistic, which doesn't really address the real interfaith that I was talking about earlier. So that's on one level, that's that. Now, the conversation with secularism is a very interesting one, because we can't run away from the fact that we are living in a secular world. And the secular world here is, of course, very much imposed from the world that has shaped the current modernity that emerged out of the European experience. Because, from the era of the Enlightenment, the disenchantment of the world, and formation of nation states, centralization of power of the state to determine its boundaries, including the separation of church and state. So all these factors are something that is the reality of the kind of world that we are living in. And definitely we need to revisit that, because the homo-religiousness that I was talking about is something that is very basic, and therefore what sociologists in the period of the mid-20th century failed to see is the lasting power of religion, because it provides meaning in community and sense-making that the secular world is not able to provide, despite the promise of the dialectical movement of society towards the absolute in the Hegelian sense, right? So that's why people were quite surprised with what they term as the return of religion from the 70s onward. Say the born-again movement, the rise of the politicization of religion, all the way to the current situation where we have global religious extremism or terrorism. So what does it mean? It means that there are certain desires that are not met in terms of what the human is seeking for. And unless that void is being filled, we will continuously be faced with the challenges that we are observing right now with regards to all the different ideologies that are actually religion in any other word. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but I think we can't run away from not talking about religion. Yeah, and this is something that some scholars like Habermas, for example, is calling for this term of we are living in a post-secular society. I don't quite like the term, but essentially what it means is that religion has never been expunged from society. It's always been there, and we just have to acknowledge it, and we have to re-engage with religion in this current context. And in Singapore, we are observing that. I mean, in the period of the 1990s, for example, or before 1990s, in the 1980s, we find that the state has to grapple with this whole idea, or maybe before, I'll go a bit earlier. There was a sense similar to Peter Berger and some other sociologists in the early years were saying, as society modernized and secularized, you will find that religion will be pushed to the private sphere more and more, and eventually either disappear or become of little relevance. And you are observing that maybe in one point of history, and we're still observing it in Europe, for example, but not in America, but in Europe, where churches are empty and people don't feel that they need religion to continue their daily lives or to make sense of their daily lives and all that. So they're living in a post-religious society, for example. That's how some people term it, right? Or a post-God world. And I think Singapore at that time also was not totally in line with this whole secularization thesis, but there was this sense that okay, we can get on top of things because we have established a secular state, and we can get on top of things, and religion will play the role of helping the state in its development agenda. But 1980s was a different experience. You find a full-on rise of religious lobbying, aggressive proselytization, churches, growth of churches exponentially, and you find religious identity politics taking root and starting to create tensions in society. It cuts across the religion. You find the rise of Hindu nationalism in the period of the 1980s. You find the revival of Buddhism. Of course, in the global sphere, it's much more stuck was this whole rise of Islamism, or the idea of the turn towards the global ummah, that eventually, people like Huntington would say it's a clash of civilizations. Actually, it's not, but it's framed that way ever since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Now, Christianity, of course, the rise of Christian right in America and how globally it's expanding its missions, and in Singapore, aggressive proselytization actually caused a bit of tensions, including inter-ethnic tensions as well as tensions within the Chinese community in particular that is dealing with this younger generation moving away from traditional Chinese religions and refusing to participate in some of the traditional religious practices like ancestral, well, it's not really worship, but they call it ancestral worship, things like that. So eventually, of course, that led to the whole commissioning of the study on religion and religious revivalism. 1987 was released, and then it became the basis for the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act in 1990. Now, after that was this idea that keep religions at bay and confined within their own community, and we expand the secular space. We try not to, and we should not bring religion into public sphere, schools especially. So religion, no more in schools. Previously, there was even religious knowledge curriculum that is taught in school, right? In the early 80s, the state actually introduced religious studies into public schools, and then by 1987, 1988, they stopped it, because it became, there was a lot of controversy surrounding that. Now, 1990s was this secularization period in full aggressive sense, and it also marks a period of liberalization of the public sphere also to some extent. Yeah? That's why you find the rise of non-religious voices becoming stronger in the period of the 1990s. Two groups actually utilized the opening up of these spaces, which previously was really the guardians of morality were quite strong in terms of maintaining that sphere. But 1990s was totally different. Two groups. This was the atheist community that find new spaces for them to actually form communities and be open about it, which of course eventually many of them congregate and began to form a society, and the Humanist Society was approved in 2010. So imagine it took a decade for them to actually mobilize and come together, and now many of them are in Humanist Society Singapore. The second group is the LGBT community. So that became visible, and of course now those traditional religious voices, particularly the conservative ones, now are trying to re-enter the secular space and re-engage because they felt that the state is not playing that role of the guardians of public morality, especially with the casino issue coming in, with the LGBT rights issue coming in. So a lot of this space. So, and of course, 2001, September 11 happened, and that I think that was quite pivotal in shifting this whole idea that we cannot now not talk about religion. Religion is entering the public space, is confronting groups that are traditionally not in the secular space. Now they are in the secular space, and the religious communities feel that we also can have our right now to enter into that a bit more democratizing space, especially with the rise of social media. Also, it's a game changer, it's a leveler. So everyone is now coming in and re-engaging within that secular space that was imagined to be non-religious and without any religious element. But actually, the elements were there, it's just that now it becomes more overt. And that's why you find now people are just engaging on religious issues and openly on social media everywhere. I mean, how can you avoid that? Because the world itself is now confronted with religious identity politics issues, religious extremism, religious violence. You have to talk about religion. And you can't say that this is something that is part of the OB markers that once used to shape how we think about religion. We should not leave it to the private sphere, we should not talk about it openly. Now we are talking about it openly, but it's how we talk about religion and how we understand religion and its role in the public sphere. That's where the conversation should be going.
That was a fascinating take into the history of religion in Singapore. I noticed two dualities.
Okay.
The first duality is the coexistence of both state secularism and religions in Singapore, and it's a beautiful tension that I'm seeing, and both are coexisting. And the second tension or duality I'm seeing is that of your history in where there was a need for some basic religious education that provided a certain sense of anchor and stability, which was necessary in any young person's first years. Yeah. And from then onwards, there was this openness to explore as well. Yeah. Now, what I feel I'm noticing is this understanding where there is both a collective and an individual understanding of religion and the role it plays in creating meaning for society. And this is in constant evolution. It's dynamic, and there's this element of progressive revelation as well. Like, the understanding, the individual understanding and the collective understanding of religion in any point in time in our history, it's progressively revealed. As more information comes and as more people interact with one another, the knowledge compounds and it creates a new shared understanding which is necessary. And there's this beauty to not knowing everything in absolute terms, because then there is a need for us to connect with one another through a shared sense of interdependence, through dialogue, where this shared revelation or progressive revelation occurs. And so that tension is beautiful between the desire of the state to be secular and then the desire of religious groups to exert a certain form of religiosity, as well as the need to cultivate a form of religious principles to form a certain form of anchor in a person's life at the beginning, and as well as having the openness to explore other religions. I think you need both. You can't have, it's not a binary and it's not one at the exclusion of the others, but there is this beautiful polarity that needs to be managed in any point in time. So that's my observation, and it's a beautiful, it allows for us to then suspend our very absolutist perspectives or take on matters, and to get into a space of shared vulnerability like this, where we have some humility that something is about to unfold and that's about to be revealed to us in this shared space.
I mean, it's beautiful how you put it. I think the tensions, let's talk about the state first. The tension is really, a modern state has to grapple with issue of diversity. All modern states are plural, in the sense that you find very few societies around the world today that are homogeneous. Of course, with human migration across the globe, and with the full-on globalization since the last half a century or so, you'll find that most societies are now dealing with this issue. I mean, you look at the issue of the refugee crisis in Europe. Of course, before that is the whole migration from third world to the first world in terms of making a living. The chain of production across the globe also means labor that circulates. So societies are plural societies. How do you manage now a plural society? And that's something that, of course, is not unique to Singapore, but Singapore has its own experiences in dealing with this whole idea of a plural society, right? So it comes down to the idea of governance. For a modern state, how do you govern a plural society? And this is where tensions lie, because different states will have different models. Of course, by plural society, in Singapore at least, under British colonialism, it's understood to be society with different ghettoized communities, each having their own areas to live in, and they will only meet and mingle in the marketplace for commerce, for trade, and then after that back to their own communities, isolated from each other. And that's where you find stereotypes also emerge within that context, right? But Singapore's experience is how to actually make these concentric circles, to expand and connect each other's, connect the communities where they will have that space where they can be who they are, but at the same time they will also have that intersection with other communities, and it's about expanding their common space.
I think I'm also trying to find ways of grounding this and making it accessible to some viewers for whom these issues might be quite abstract and whatever. And I feel, where a lot of what we're talking about, where the rubber hits the pavement, right, is when you're talking about the state needing to govern this plurality. One of the things that I think about is that a lot of religions and moral beliefs are about like harm and how to prevent harm. And this seems to be something, we can all agree on, like we should just try and prevent harmful behavior. But beyond the obvious like physical acts of harm where I'm actually hitting someone or causing physical violence, there can be a whole sort of like disagreement over what constitutes harm, right? So for instance, a lot of secular people would say that even moderate religious beliefs, if let's say a moderate religious believer, if they don't question the more fundamentalist views in their religion, that they're allowing harm to happen, right? Like they're not checking that, right? So and they want some of these ideas to be like nipped in the bud before they go on to cause harm, right? Like it's kind of sort of a preventative thing, right? Similarly, religious groups might view, let's say, the existence of LGBT behavior, like just the very existence of that, as harmful to a community, right? So, these are all like, no actual physical harm is being caused, but in people's minds, if you don't address it, like it's a slippery slope and it will eventually lead to something that's more harmful. Yeah, I was just curious, if let's say you were talking to someone who may not be very educated or whatever, how would you actually help them reason about this idea of like, harm, and is, a form of harm, is it something that's manufactured or is it real?
Yeah. Sorry, before that, let me just correct my previous comment. It was not Charles Kimball's book, When Religion Becomes Evil. It's actually Rachel Mikva talks about this idea of the elect as being an issue that needs to be looked at. But nonetheless, Kimball's book has 5 warning signs that are very important for us, for people of religion to actually check on their religious ideas to make sure that it does not devolve into something that becomes dangerous. Okay, now the idea of harm, right? It's a bit more complex because what constitutes harm, right? I mean, let's go into the whole philosophical debate. What is harm? You know, for some people, it's harmful for you to aggressively trying to convert another person, because it's like, why would you want to do that and not respect the dignity of the other person who already has a religious faith and committed to that, and here you want to convert because at the back of your mind, if he doesn't convert to my faith, he's going to burn in hell forever. But from the perspective of someone who engages in that, it will be harmful for that person if he doesn't convert to my religion, and therefore actually I'm doing a good thing for that person. I'm trying to save that person, you know, and as a good person, I would want that person to be saved from harm in the hereafter. So it's really the positionality and how people understand this whole principle of harm. Of course, when you talk about harm that are obvious, it's easy. I mean, you don't require deep theological or philosophical idea to say that killing an innocent person is a no-no, right? And in fact, no religion that I know of would permit murder of an innocent person. But there will always be this whole notion of who constitutes the innocent. And that's the problem, you know. The problem with theological semantical gymnastics that actually distort the whole simple principle of non-harm that all religions claim to preach, right? Let's look at the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, for example, or Osama bin Laden, who justify killing of innocent Americans as legitimate because in his definition, these Americans, even though they're civilians, they are not innocent. They actually propped up the American regime that is killing Muslims in other parts of the world. So what constitutes the innocent lives here is something that can be distorted by terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, right? So it's really quite complex, but how do we bring that message to the common person on the street is to actually go back to a simple principle of not just do no harm, but do unto others how you want others to do unto you. So that is kind of a golden rule principle that many religions will agree with, right? So you can tell the person on the street, okay, would you like, for example, someone to keep on pestering you to convert to his faith? You wouldn't like that. So why would that person be so annoying? If you don't like that, apply that same principle. Why should you also be going around doing that kind of thing, right? So the golden rule applies. Yeah, I mean, if you, and this is interesting. I had this conversation. You know, some Muslims, again, I'll be controversial here. They have this difficulty somehow grappling with the whole idea of child marriage. Some Muslims, yeah, I'm not saying this is, I don't want to create this impression that it's stereotypically Muslims to permit child marriage. It's only a certain segment of Muslims because they understood a medieval principle that is used in the past, but of course society has evolved and today we don't understand it in that lens. In the lens that someone who attained puberty is considered a full-grown, responsible adult and therefore of a marriageable status. So you imagine a 9-year-old girl, for example, can have a menses at the age of 9, and it's crazy to think that she's already an adult and therefore she can get married. Of course, in pre-modern society, they have a different conception, and that's why you have marriages that are constituted very early in their lives. But today, we don't think of a 9-year-old as an adult, even though she has a menses, because having a menses doesn't mean that she's biologically ready to carry a child, as well as to fulfill the responsibility that is required in a marriage. And her mental development may not correspond to her having her period. So there's a lot of these new scientific ideas that has evolved that cause our ideas on that whole notion of from childhood to adulthood. That's why we have the whole category now, like the teenagers or the what you call adolescent stage and all that, right? But if we rely on medieval way of thinking about this issue, or the categories that are used by scholars of that pre-modern period, then we come to a problem. That is why when in some Muslim countries, when they wanted to raise the age, the limit, the what do you call that, the age of marriage, from 16 to 18, even that caused an uproar, It's like, oh, you cannot meddle with this is religious sanction and all that. Now, going back to the principle of non-harm, I would say you will say this kind of thing and say that Islam permits it and therefore you should not go against it. But imagine your own daughter. Will you marry off your own daughter at the age of 16? And then they would say, or 9 years old. See, you have to be consistent with it. If you say this is what the religion requires, and this is what you will advocate, and you will go against people who try to meddle with this, will you marry off your own daughter who's 9 years old? She had a menses. Say if a suitor comes and wants to marry her, you will say no, of course. She's still my baby, my child. I want her to go through school and finish school and all that. So you're not consistent. So what you say of what the religion demands is something that goes against your personal conscience. Something is wrong here. So in this whole enterprise, you can see, right, how people have double standards and they are not really thinking through many of the things that they say, this is what my religion demands, and therefore I will stand by this principle. But they will not do it when it comes to their own sphere. So there are many issues like that. Yeah. So the principle of non-harm must be must be combined with this whole idea of the golden rule.
The golden rule, yeah. So I want to drill a little deeper, and so I'm not actually sure what your, let's say, stance on gay and lesbian rights are. How would you, let's say, use this argument with a religious person to say, oh, you shouldn't really be imposing your views on gays and lesbians? Because if you said to them, imagine your own child, what would you want to do? That person could actually say, oh, I actually would want the community to step in and intervene and persuade my child that they are following the wrong path. So how would you and first of all, what is your stance on gay and lesbian rights, and how what is your view on how you'd approach this?
I think this is I'm not sure exactly what is the question that you are asking, because it's really a complicated issue that has different components to that, right? But if you're asking me, firstly, I think the whole debate over this LGBT issue, that seems to be a tension between the more religious-minded members of society and the so-called more liberal or secular segments of society. I think this is a false divide. I believe it's a false divide, but let's posit it that way. People need to make a distinction between the theological lens that they adopt in viewing this view versus the standpoint as a citizen who is seen as equal before the law. So these are two separate issues. So in a way, conservatives can keep to their religious view. No one is saying that they have to change their opinion that homosexual act is sinful. You can keep that opinion if you think that that is what your religion says, fine. But here we are talking about LGBTQ rights, which has got to do with the whole idea of citizenry, of your place in society with people who have differing views, and how the state now looks at this issue. And if the state is a secular state, it cannot be adopting a religious lens in terms of managing this tension. It has to be from the common framework of citizenry and that's the whole issue lah. So I would tell my Muslim friends, if you disagree with homosexuality and you think homosexuality is a sin, it's every right of yours to believe that way, but it's different from talking about how LGBTs should have a place in society, because firstly, not everyone subscribes to your theological view, and you have to respect that. Just like as a Muslim, you can respect the Christians and the Buddhists to have their own space and their own church, temple, and all that, and you can coexist peacefully and without trying to obliterate them and discriminate against them, right? Why don't you apply that same principle to the LGBT community, who should have an equal space in society and not be discriminated, and especially not to be seen as a criminal simply for having a different sexual orientation.
So I'm actually quite persuaded by these arguments, but I'm wondering, when you say you talk to your Muslim friends, how do you feel you're actually able to sort of shift their attitudes?
I mean, definitely for those who are willing to engage in a dialogue and be fair and listen, I mean, to the arguments from both sides, to what people really have to say about the issue, they would come to a more, they will moderate their opinions, yeah? But of course, the problem is not with these people who are willing to engage. The problem is people who feel that they already know what they want, and they're just putting out that stand out there, and they're not listening to whatever people are saying. They're not interested even in meeting the people that they're talking about. Yeah, I mean, for me, okay, if you have an issue with homosexuality, come, let's meet with a homosexual person and listen to their everyday live experience. Will you want to do that? Some of them will be scared. What are you scared of? You think he's going to convert you into becoming a gay? I mean, that's a very ridiculous idea, right? So just come and listen. I mean, it's the same principle we work on interfaith issue, right? Someone is, I mean, a Muslim is so afraid to meet a Christian. Why is your faith very weak that you feel that the moment you meet a Christian, suddenly you want to become a Christian? So let's have that courage to actually sit down and listen deeply and connect deeply with the everyday reality of that person that you talk so much about, but have never met in person, have never sit down and have a coffee and have a deep conversation with that person, because you might be surprised by what you will encounter if you meet with that person. Just like people say, there's an agenda, Of course, there will be a minority of people who are vocal about it in fighting for equality, and that's to be expected, especially if they feel discriminated, and they are discriminated in many sense. But the agenda of the typical homosexual person, at least what I know, is to wake up in the morning, go to work, get a living for themselves, deal with all these problems, same problems that you and I are facing in our everyday lives. That's the agenda. What is this you're talking about as though there is this huge force that is trying to change society, No. I think we will have a different opinion the moment we sit down and we really listen deeply and try to empathize on the lived experience of the other person that we feel we have stereotypical views about. Yeah.
I love what you said about that summons to have the courage to deeply listen. I think that's a great sort of call to people. I have one more question and I'll hand it over to you, but I wanted to go back to something you had said near the beginning, where it was you actually think this divide between over the LGBT issue, like that, it's between the conservative religious people and then progressive liberals, and you actually think that's a false, you felt it was a false opposition or dichotomy, and I'm just curious. No. What I'm saying is it's a false distinction to see the divide is between the religious community and the secular communities. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Because it assumes that all religious people are against LGBT rights.
Okay, got it. Right. Yeah. And that's a false assumption.
Yeah, and people who are accepting of LGBT are people with no faith or very little belief in their own religion, so they're secular, Yeah, so it's a false divide. I mean, we find deeply religious people actually challenged to speak up on behalf of the LGBTs who are discriminated and who are suffering. And of course, we have religious communities that are ministering to the needs of this community that has been marginalized and suffering. So you can't say that if you're a religious person, therefore you're anti-LGBT. No. What I find out there is not as clear-cut as that. Of course, in the Christian community, you can see even the Free Community Church is an inclusive church that is welcoming of LGBT community, and they are committed Christians. I know the pastor, I know people who are in that church. Can you call them as they are not religious or they are not Christian or not true Christians? Who are we to say that, right? And of course, at the global front, a lot of churches are welcoming of LGBT community. So what are we talking about here when we talk about the divide between the religious and the non-religious? It's a false dichotomy.
Yeah, as a facilitator of interfaith dialogue, or for someone like me who facilitates intrafaith dialogue as well within my community, what are the essential ingredients of a space that is inclusive and that respects people's different beliefs?
Yeah.
And so I heard one thing that you mentioned was listen. Yeah, but very deeply. Yeah, and I would like to understand a bit more about listening deeply. The second one you mentioned was lived experience of every person matters. Yeah, the third thing that I picked up was context matters. It's almost as if, like the analogy that came to my mind was there's a prism. We learned in physics there's a prism and white light enters the prism, but it refracts into multiple colors. And the prism represents context. And context has got elements of theology, it's got elements of a lived experience of a person, history of a culture, or the culture of the place. So all this is the prism, right? And what I'm seeing is that white light refracts itself across multiple space-time dimensions, geographically across the world. And what we need is a space that helps us to better understand the context through which our experience or our versions of truth, which could be all the same, is refracted or filtered through. So I think, so those are the three things I personally picked out on as a facilitator of intra and interfaith dialogue. Are there any other things that we need to bear in mind when it comes to competing needs, harms and interests between different groups of people, be they faith groups or secular groups? How do we manage and mediate or even negotiate these tensions and competing needs?
Firstly, I think is to embrace that very tension itself. I mean, I've come to spaces where people refuse to engage in these tensions, and they would want to avoid talking about differences. Then we don't move anywhere, In some interfaith circle, I've seen people just they just want to talk about commonalities, for example, and a kind of a kumbaya approach of interfaith, of course, we know we are all humans. I prick you. What was that famous Shakespeare word? If I prick you, do I not feel the
if you cut me, I do not bleed as much, right?
Yes,
Shylock from
Shylock from
Venice.
Merchant of Venice. That's right. Blood is red, right? But I think a better approach would be to actively talk about our differences and develop the capacity to manage this tension of keeping my personal integrity. That means I have the right to believe what I believe in, but at the same time according that same right to the other person, and from there we move on to this idea that we may not have common ideas about many of these issues, but we can actually recognize that we both meant well and we both have a common concern for the good of society, for example. So we may not have the common idea, but we have a common concern, and we start from there. we cannot start from this idea that just because that person disagrees with me, that person is evil. And there's a very interesting book, who's this? Jonathan Haidt, right? Why Good People Are Divided Over Religion and Politics. Take a look at that book and see what you can draw from that. Because the tendency now is for people to say, if you disagree with me, then you are a fool, and you are stupid, you are all the negative terms. You already draw a line, and you see the other as your enemy instead of your opponent in ideas. But this needs to be brought in and to be discussed openly, and that's the role of the facilitator like yourself. But also in that space, you have to create a way of making people be safe to say things that goes against the grain, to say their own deepest experience without this whole judgment coming upon them. So that safety needs to be established first, especially for vulnerable groups who don't have this kind of spaces to actually say certain things, because out there they will be shut down by the more louder voices or the more strident voices. But I think the concept of safe space needs to evolve also, because we must recognize that within that safe space also there are different dynamics. I mean, you cannot say, how do you manage, for example, if in that safe space you have a racist and a person who is at the receiving end of racism. So that person who has been a target of racism will have, okay, this is a safe space, let me tell you my experience of facing racism against me. And then after that, the facilitator say, okay, no judgment, okay, let's hear from this other person, and that person, so and go on a full run over his racist ideas and how these other groups are a danger to society. Then it doesn't create that safe space, right? So as a facilitator, you have to take note, how do you allow that racist person to say what he wants to say, because it's important that a racist person be made to articulate his racism openly so that it can be challenged, it can be corrected, and it can be rehabilitated. Because if you keep it and say he has no right to say it, also it can be problematic at times, because then it doesn't get articulated, it doesn't get corrected. Because, of course, if that person is overtly racist and know that he's racist, then there's a different question from those who are not conscious of their racism, right? So you must allow that space also. But I think we need a kind of courage in this whole process. And that's another term that I need to mention, plus the list of all the other attributes or values that you have spoken of. Courage is one thing that is often missing. And that courage is actually more for people who wants to be transformed by that process of dialogue. I've been to many dialogue sessions. People are just too eager to say their views, but they don't reflect on what they're saying. And when you tell them you have to listen, I'm listening, but sometimes they are listening in order to process it through their own lens and make sense of what the other person is saying, instead of trying to understand it from the perspective of that person, right? And secondly, sometimes they listen in order to counter. So that kind of listening defeats the whole purpose of dialogue. What does it mean to have courage? It means that when you listen, it's with the intention of actually allowing what you hear to challenge your own perspectives. And that requires courage, because a lot of people are afraid to question their own beliefs, because that's the foundation of their security. And that's why fundamentalists are very afraid of deep questioning, because they felt that if their whole worldview is being challenged, they lose everything. But here we have to gently say that, look, there's a different way of looking at things. It's not a zero-sum game that, if your whole worldview collapses, then it creates so much anxiety that, you tend to dig in further, right? But make them transit to a different point of view slowly, and therefore they can actually transform themselves. But create that conditions where they can have courage to question themselves first and be transformed by what they are listening in that space, in that safe space.
To that, I like to probe deeper.
Sure.
I think we're getting somewhere that it's quite personal for me as well.
Okay.
And I think another ingredient is centering the margins in any conversation, understanding power dynamics, and understanding there is a group that is maybe traumatized or marginalized that doesn't even have the vocabulary to articulate the periods of marginalizations that they've been subjected to, and they might be so numb to what they've experienced that they may not even have the vocabulary to express their needs or their interest, and having a different kind of sensitivity, like it's a social sensitivity, like, you know, it's okay if you don't even know how to articulate your views, and I can feel that maybe you're frozen or you're numb. I have several episodes in my own spiritual journey. It's been very tumultuous personally for me, but like some of this, I'll name some of these episodes, and I noticed that in each and every one of these episodes, I was usually the person with less power vis-a-vis someone with more power. Now let me explain some of these episodes, right? So I was in an organization, a large organization, so I'll be from a minority religious group, and then I will have members of the majority religious group coming over and talking to me about their faith in the work setting. Or I'll see people of the majority group convening during lunchtime with senior management from that group, also having a discussion with them, and that sub-communicates something that you know, I'm not part of that group, and so in order to fit in, I'll just come and join, and you know, I will minimize my own faith. I will tend to self-censor as well. So I think it's a lot about power and understanding. And there's this thing about obliviousness, like privilege obliviousness or power obliviousness. Those with power are really clueless about the power and the privilege they have. And communicating that, like, you know, I feel a little excluded from the fact that, you know, members of a certain religious group are gathering during lunchtime conversations with senior managers. You know, will this deprive me of career opportunities or career progression? Another context or example is I'm with the pastor of a church, you know, and I'm actively I'm open to listening about the Christian faith, for example. But the moment he says something about my faith in an attempt to convert me that is maybe not true, I don't know, I just freeze and I don't want to take the conversation further, because for fear of offending him and for fear of ruining a relationship. So there are just so many of these microaggressions, I think.
You're right.
And it's very queasy. It's an emotional roller coaster. I'm not sure if you've encountered spaces like this, but how do I even communicate that I'm not comfortable without appearing weak and vulnerable, and then thus giving someone else the opportunity to exploit or take advantage of my vulnerability as well.
Because you raise a very important issue here. It's the power dynamics within that space, and that's why sometimes you need spaces where minorities or marginalized communities are able to talk within that safe space that we mentioned earlier. And in that space, I think it's important for those who are in privileged position to actually remain silent. Sometimes, we forget that the best thing to do is to keep quiet and listen to the experience of those who we tend to brush aside or doesn't come into our orbit or sphere. So it's a cultivation of the mind that we need to develop in society. Always ask who is not at the table. If you are constantly reminded who is not at the table, it will create a kind of habitus in you, that every time you attend a particular gathering, then okay, who are we excluding today, and work actively to address that and try to be more inclusive. Of course, it doesn't mean you adopt tokenism. Sometimes there is another problem, since we are all of this particular race, I think we need someone from that race and then bring that person in, but the rest of the conversation doesn't involve that person. That's tokenism, right? Just to show that you are being inclusive. That is also wrong, right? So asking who's not at the table, and also actively making sure that that table is equal and fair for everyone. Yeah, I think that's the principle that we can adopt in society. That is why the principle of equality, fairness is so important in the way we want to manage our diverse society. Because equality here can also be understood as equity also, in terms of justice. What's our pledge again? Regardless of race, language or religion. Of course, now I think we should add more things, right? Regardless of gender, sexual orientation. Recently, the former NMP Anthea Ong has came up with a new pledge. I don't know how controversial that is, but I think, regardless of nationality, even and regardless of social class, and a lot of all these divides in society, to build a democratic society based on justice and equality. So it cannot be just simply regardless of race, language or religion or whatever other categories. To build a democratic society, and a democratic society is not where majoritarianism rules. Because sometimes people have this idea democracy means whoever is the majority gets to dictate. No, democracy has a dual aspect that you are just seeing one aspect, which who was that? Mill, John Stuart Mill was talking about, right? He was saying it should not be about majoritarianism, tyranny of the majority. That's the term he used. But the second aspect is actually protection of the minorities, and taking care of those who are lesser and weaker than you are in society. So it has to be this dual aspect. Otherwise, the democracy we are talking about is that of majoritarianism, tyranny of the majority, and that's very dangerous. That's how we are seeing now happening in many parts of the world, right? And what does it mean to be true democracy that takes care of the minorities is to establish quality, justice and equality. Yeah, that's the only way forward, I think. That's why it's still a work in progress. But at least we have we have these seeds that needs to be nurtured, pour some water, tend to it so that it can really blossom. Rather than we have it there but we neglect it, and then we say we'll see how society evolves. I think it needs active involvement of the citizens to actually nurture that seeds that have been planted as part of our progressive beginning of Singapore state. We have it there. It's just about how we want to push it further.
Wow. Beautiful.
Yeah.
I want to give you the opportunity to go as deep as you want on this topic.
Do you
please.
Want to
keep going, or?
Yeah, I think like if you explore fundamentalism or even extremism, at the heart of it, it's maybe a consequence of or a response to bigotry, probably, or power. I don't know, but the underlying thread I'm seeing is across like the conversations we've had, right? It's really about exertion of my power and my superiority or bigotry, which
so you're saying they are responding to something.
There's this African proverb that I really like, right, which is also explaining the whole which is in opposition to tyranny of the majority, which is the child who's not embraced by the village will burn down the village just to feel its warmth, right? And so there's so many marginalized communities, and they're silent, like they're not even visible. And people in power or privilege don't even see them. The burning down of the village is actually a symptom of a deeper problem of exclusion. I've been isolated and I've been excluded and I've been marginalized against, and you're not seeing this. I think that for me it's the heart of, let's say, extremism, or fundamentalism, because you feel threatened, and that's the reason why in your attempt to exert some form of certainty and stability.
Yeah. Yeah, of course you're right.
If I was so secure, I would be open to hearing someone else's views to challenge mine.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, as much as fundamentalists proclaim their certainty with almost absoluteness, as though they are speaking like God, right? Actually, underlying that is their insecurity, right? And it's important, of course, not to confront fundamentalism head on like that, but rather to try to understand what causes that insecurity.
Yeah.
And once you dig deeper, of course, there's a lot of issues that we are complicit to. And I think this is important. Whenever we encounter a problem, always ask how we are complicit to that problem. So we don't see as though like they are the problem and we are the solution. I think that is a very wrong paradigm to begin with. We must see ourselves as, I like the term that you use, of course in Buddhism it's something that is emphasized a lot, interdependency, right? We must see things that, everything that happens in this world, they are all interconnected and we are all interdependent of each other. And therefore, if there's a problem out there, how am I complicit to that, right? If there's a problem of human trafficking, do you think that you are totally absolved of any responsibility, or you are part of this whole global system that actually drives hyper-capitalism, that exploits labor, and therefore somewhere along the line you are partly responsible for that condition of human trafficking? Do you think in that way, or you think that, this is another problem and it's not part of my problem? When you look at poverty in Africa, do you think we in Singapore are not complicit to this whole system that's created this whole global inequality at that level, where wealth of the top 1% resides in, only a handful of individuals? We are somewhere in between, which means we can't extricate ourselves from all this. So it's always important to also ask, besides who's not at the table, which we talk about, what interests are we dealing with, and whose interests are we serving whenever we talk about certain issues in a certain way. And more importantly, what are we not asking? What are the silences that we don't talk about? The absences. Karl Mannheim, this German sociologist, always talk about the sociology of the absence. What is missing in that conversation? And that missing thing, that silence thing, or that absence actually speaks about the problem that we are trying to address. So I think it's about conditioning the mind to be able to critically identify a problem. And I use this framework that is proposed by this sociologist Syed Hussein Alatas. Identify a problem, define it, why it's a problem. You have to define the problem, and then you engage in a diagnosis of it. Only then you offer solution. So don't jump straight to solution giving, properly diagnose the situation. And in that diagnosis, sometimes we have to see how we are all complicit to this whole problem, and what interests are involved in this issue. Whose interests are we serving? And therefore, in that whole issue of fundamentalism, it's really about that. You're right, they're also responding to something. So if we can get down to the root of it, maybe we can persuade things to be done differently. And for the fundamentalists, there's one other aspect that I think we need to talk about. A defining feature for me, for a fundamentalist mind, is the inability to entertain doubt. I think that's very crucial. Sorry, I'm biased. I studied philosophy, so doubt plays a very important role in the philosophical enterprise, So,
yeah, well, we're big believers in the value of doubt as well here.
But is doubt something that is an antithesis to religion? Because religion always talks about, the certainty. It's about this building that certainty in faith, But actually, no. You have to, if you dig into the religious tradition, you'll find that doubt plays a very important role in the evolution of religious ideas, in the contestation of different religious thinkers. We remember doubt as being the starting point was Descartes, right? But no, I mean, prior to Descartes, even in the Muslim tradition, Al-Ghazali has developed his magnum opus from the starting point of doubt about his own ideas, and that's led him to exploration, which he wrote in his autobiography, and he discovered Sufism as something that gives him that kind of certainty in his heart. Of course, in other religious traditions, doubt plays a very important. So that is something that I think we need to rediscover, and this is where I think going back to this Rachel McVa's book, very important book. Let me just note down what was the title. Yeah, title of the book is Dangerous Religious Ideas, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Where actually she talks about all religious ideas are dangerous because they have the seed to actually corrupt society, but at the same time also they can be a remedy for the problems in society. It has a dual function, as how you're familiar with what Karl Marx said, right? We only quote one part of what he said, is the opiate of the masses, but it's also the heart of the heartless world. So it's that dual dimension of religion that makes religion fascinating and will always be present in society, which goes back to our earlier point, right? So what McVa was talking about is to uncover and rediscover this self-critical dimension of the faith. Let's take scripture, for example, right? We talk about LGBT issue and all that, then people will say, oh, this is what the scripture say. So it has that issue of a sole authoritative and, in this sense, authoritarian voice to say it has to be this way because the scripture says so. But if we understand scripture from the whole spectrum of tradition of that faith, then the scripture, understanding of the scripture also has that self-critical dimension where religious thinkers, theologians, scholars, exegetes were developing the internal mechanism to keep check so that scripture does not become authoritarian. It remains authoritative, but it's not authoritarian. So that what fundamentalists are losing is the internal self-critique within the religion that has been developed throughout the tradition. And there's a problem of modernity because the modern world, fundamentalists thought that there's a sharp break between the pre-modern period and the modern world, and therefore they would like to do away with a lot of traditions, and in that whole process they throw the baby out with the bathwater, and they lost that internal mechanism of the religious tradition that is able to self-correct its authoritarian or dangerous aspects that McVa was talking about.
Yeah, there are a couple of ways I would like to go from here. I mean, okay, so actually one of the things I would like to do is actually practice sitting in the discomfort or having uncomfortable conversations, right? And being okay with that. So, if you had to apply a label to me, I would call myself an atheist, but a spiritual person. So I believe in a transcendent reality that we don't quite understand. It's mysterious, and I'm curious about it and seeking it, right? But when you talk about scripture, when you talk about certain religious beliefs, like where people believe in it literally, that's where I have a certain resistance to it. I sort of disagree. Like if you actually talk about the different religious books as beautiful metaphors, that I can totally accept, right? They're beautiful stories, they're works of literature, I can take that. If you talk about like a supernatural being up there somewhere who, like, let's say if you're a Christian, you believe in someone with long flowing hair and he's a man and he actually spends his time trying to listen to your prayers, and like that's something I find very hard to believe in, right? But I do wonder if like secular modern science has its own fundamentalism. Like let's say, growing up, I would, or even now, like we are told that the universe was created by a big bang, and this is the fundamental reality of nature. It's made of these particles. There's a certain fundamentalism to that, which I think in the past, just like yourself, I was probably more fundamentalist. But then now, I'm actually willing to say, look, science doesn't have the whole truth. And I'm wondering if it's because science kept saying that we are the official story of the universe, That actually, like what you said, that kind of bigotry forced people with religious beliefs to take an even stronger stance in their beliefs to counter that. So yeah, I don't know. I just I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here, but like how would you approach these metaphysical disagreements if like I actually think it's absurd to think of a supernatural being up there?
You're not too far off from what I believe too. Of course, when we talk about theology, there's no single theology, it's theologies. So, I mean, this idea that, it's a problem of dualism that has shaped a lot of modern thinking emerging from Descartes onwards, this whole binary of mind and body and whole dualistic notion is something that is not even common in the non-European traditions in the pre-modern period. So actually there's a lot of decolonizing that we need to do. A lot of our ideas actually in the modern world is shaped by this Euro-Centric perspective that has emerged as a result of the spread of European civilization across the world, and especially informed by the process of the Enlightenment philosophy. So this idea that there's a being out there which is different and separate from creation is not something how orthodoxy in Judaism will view it. God is in this world, with this world. It's not a separate thing. It's not like a grandfather figure that is down there. And actually it also depends on how we understand religion, as whether it's something that is transactional or not. Yeah, I know I grew up with a transactional view of religion, and with something that I've outgrown in the sense that there's this God which like a father figure somewhere, and then if you want to pass your exam, you pray to God, God will give you, right? And I was thinking, if I want to go out and play football, and I don't want it to rain. So God, please, I want to play football, please don't. And then it doesn't rain, But another person out there was hoping for rain because he or she needed the rain for whatever reasons. How does God now manage this? Right? It creates a lot of philosophical conundrum there, and it's not a very mature way of understanding religion. It's very transactional. You want A, then God gives you, and it's very self-centric also. Of course, that's not how the theology actually is in the world religions like Islam, Christianity, Judaism. I mean, or even sometimes when we use certain of these categories, we have to be mindful that I'm coming from an Abrahamic perspective, and that's not how someone from Buddhist faith or Hindu faith or Jain or other faiths would view God even, or is there such thing as God? Some people say Buddhism is an atheistic religion. So I must not be imposing my perspective, and some of the terms I use, even theology, it's the study of theos or God. What does this God means, So I think we have to be mindful of how we actually articulate some of these things. But sometimes we can't run away from it because we grew up in that tradition and we say it in that way. Now, actually what I want to say, this whole idea of science replacing religion, right? Again, that's a problem that emerged with the period of the Enlightenment, with this whole faith in progress of humans, that this linear idea of progression of humanity, which is a problem, because you find that there's nothing that secures that idea that it has to be that way other than faith in the idea of progress itself and the idea of science being able to replace religion. But science is just a method. Science is a method. It's not a creed, and this is where people often don't realize that science answers a different set of questions compared to religion. This Evans Pritchard, who's an anthropologist, once studied Azande tribe, and I mean this whole idea, Fraser's idea that of this distinction between the primitive societies and civilized society. This is totally outmoded, and something we should be dispensed with, But yeah, so Prikat was saying that when he studied at Azam, of course they know why the roof of their house collapsed on them, because the termites were eating through the woods. Perfectly logical, cause and effect, scientific, right? I mean, science is about cause and effect. Then they are able to have a scientific thinking of why the roof collapsed. But what they have an added element is the why. Why at that particular time and hit that particular person? This is where religion gives an answer that science doesn't. Science talks about the mechanics of it and why it falls, but the meaning behind it is only something that the belief system will explain. So in this sense, Azandi feel that some other person is sending a magical power because that doesn't like that person. That's why make the roof collapse. But of course, they know it's the termites that eat through, but the why is a separate question. That's why religion will always persist, because it answers questions that cannot be answered by science. Why there is something rather than nothing? Science cannot answer that. But this belief in science, almost in a fundamentalist way, is a problem, and it means that the person doesn't understand both religion and science. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually like this idea that technology, like this phone, for instance, our belief in it is almost like a fetish. Like there is no difference between this modern thing and like what some of these cultures that the anthropologists study, because what makes this phone run? Like it's an energy system based on fossil fuels. What makes me believe that I will always have access to this energy? It is just this prevailing context of capitalism and the fact that fossil fuels will never run out. But fossil fuels can run out, and when they do, my belief in the function of this phone will be just as magical as another culture's belief in their artifacts or whatever, right? And,
And I mean, that's what religion is also. It's human construct that conforms to the conditions and the needs of society at that time. And that's why it keeps on evolving. What doesn't change is, of course, that need for the transcendence, something that's beyond that whole mystery. Some people are now calling God. God is just simply this big mystery. Instead of seeing God as a human-like figure, father figure. So there's process theology that is quite interesting. I'm not sure, you're familiar with process theology?
I've heard of the phrase. I'm not sure exactly what it refers to, but maybe you can talk about it.
I mean, I'm not the best person to explain it, but something God is both in and outside the world. So it's a creative process, like Whitehead's idea of process philosophy. Moves along with these creative dimensions that is unfolding. So God is continuously creating along with human will and choice. So, which is a very different way of understanding God compared to traditional forms of understanding God, which I feel is an infantilized idea of religion. I know I may upset a few people here, but this is basically, that's it, You have not outgrown your idea of God if you keep on. Of course, when you are young, it's something that is makes sense to you because of the capacity of the child to think. Then your parents will say, so and the child would see it as an authority figure, right? Just like the father is to that child. But I think we need to outgrow that kind of childhood state of understanding to something much more profound, which has found in the religious traditions, Meister Eckhart in the Christian tradition, or the non-dualistic philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, and or the Sufi ideas, especially from the works of Ibn Arabi. Plenty. Why must our idea of religion be from that lens that is projected by the fundamentalist views of religion? They are not even dominant throughout the religious history.
This is very interesting for me because I think this segues the conversation for me personally to spiritual mysticism, or this dualistic idea that material science is separate from spiritual science. And in the Vedas and in the Vedic tradition, the masters or the teachers actually saw them as both sides of the same coin. Yeah. So the people who are coming up with material science discoveries, astrology, telescopy, and instruments for dentistry and surgery and medicine were at the heart spiritual scientists who were also working on themselves, body, mind, spirit, through practices that were developed in their doctrines or in the tradition, like yoga and meditation.
You're right.
I just recently, over the weekend, I did a 3-day silent retreat. So a huge element of that is to achieve a state of transcendence, and it's no longer intellectual. You achieve a state of transcendence where, like, if you follow the process, and if you do this dutifully, towards the end of the 3 days, you will feel a lightening of your sense of this body, this skin encapsulated body. This body doesn't seem as heavy as your interconnectedness with everything. You know? So I think there is this beautiful part about spiritual mysticism. And if you bring this back to the interfaith dialogue space, I think that's the beautiful. I think you mentioned this thing about mystery. If you can tune into the mystery of what is unfolding, and if you can just sit in that silence and allow that spirit the transcendental spirit to speak through our bodies and our minds and through our mouths about who is the missing person in the room and what is the missing element of the conversation that can complete the jigsaw puzzle. I think that's where we can make huge leaps in progress in terms of discourse and in terms of our understanding of this divide, dualistic divide between spiritual science and material science. There's this beautiful, Rumi said this, beyond ideas of right and wrong, there is a field and I'll meet you there. How do we transcend everything and allow everyone to transcend and meet at that field?
Sorry to temper a bit of your optimism. Of course, that's beautiful, and if you can get there, that will be ideal. But temper a bit of my optimism there. Society is a bit more complex than that. If you can find like-minded individuals who are willing to explore that, then yes, and I'm personally interested. And we can explore with the Buddhist idea that what exists is just pure consciousness, right? Now, what about Plato's cave? You're familiar with Plato's cave, right? Where eventually, when the guy came back and said, you're living with these illusions and imageries and all that, they were laughing at him. They refused to follow him, and eventually he came out of the cave alone. It can be a lonely journey in that sense. And that's the nature of this whole spiritual enterprise. It's very personal and it's very experiential. And you can have approximation, but not entirely replicate the spiritual experience of the other person. We are all condemned to be free in that sense as individuals. I recall Sartre's sculpture. So not many will be able to live with that, and there's a very important novel in the Muslim tradition. It's called Hai bin Yaqzan, Hai the son of Yaqzan. Are you familiar with that? The philosopher Ibn Tufail. Take a look at that, because some people say that was the inspiration for Robinson Crusoe and all that, but anyway. So it's about this guy who actually evolved naturally from the natural world. So there's evolution theory in the Muslim tradition.
Wow.
And he was, I read that long time ago, so I'm trying to recall the important details. He was raised by a family of, was it a deer family? And eventually he discovered the world himself, because he's alone. He discovered the world and he discovered a higher reality. And then someone from an island came over and discovered him, and then he said, you must go with me back to civilization. tell the people your spiritual experience and all that, how you discover God on your own, you know, without having all these clerics, clergies, and all these religious institutions. He went to the island, but he was rejected by the people because these people wanted formalized forms of religion, and they have a prophet, and they will follow, and they will, you know, do the rituals that has been told. Eventually, these two individuals decided, you know, they give up, and they went back to that island where he was from, and they continued their journey. Sometimes it's like that.
Yeah.
You may not be able to change society. Some people would feel comfortable in their forms of religiosity, let them be. Maybe, you know, if they really feel this is the way to approach the divine, who are we to deny that, you know? That's their experience, and that's the best way they connect with. Let them be. But those who have a different view may pursue a different path. Yeah.
What I'm picking on is also the Euro-Centric worldview that's dominated my education and my worldview, and the move towards this decolonization, right?
Yeah.
And you know, I think it would be great if we could spend some time with the Orang Asli, or the indigenous tribes, the Orang Laut, or you know, like or even those who have retained indigenous wisdom or ancient wisdom practices. Yeah, it would be good to just, you know, take time off this civilization rather than bringing them into our civilization. I think it's time for us to make the reverse trip, to spend time with them and to experience their level of transcendence, their peace, their worldview.
Because we think that in modern society we have all the truths, and these truths come from science, and it goes back to your earlier point, right? And this all, to us, primitive tribes, or you know, all this, you know, we use those kind of terms, underdeveloped, or even worse, barbarians, right?
Oh my gosh.
And they don't possess what we know, but actually, they speak in metaphors, and you know what you mentioned earlier, and those metaphors contain the truths. I mean, what makes us think that the stories that are told in our scriptures, Adam and Eve and all that, are literal and not metaphors? Just like it's actually metaphors that is brought to the international level, you know, of a particular community in that area, and these stories are shared amongst people of that area. It just became a world religion, and we understood it. Of course, it doesn't mean that metaphors don't contain the truth. It's similar to how the indigenous or the tribes, you know, have their own metaphors and their own creation stories and all that. It contains truth of how they see and make sense of it. It's like what was it trying to tell you when the Bible says about eating forbidden fruit? You know, is it really about the literal idea of eating the forbidden fruit and disobeying God? I think there's something more than that. And this is the richness in hermeneutics, in exegesis that fundamentalists fail to see. It's about accountability, human responsibility. It's about free will, choice, and these are ideas that are perennial, cuts across all communities. It's the idea of being human itself, but it's told through these metaphors that circulates in the region of the Middle East, and it's also something that became scripture and shared across the world. And looking at metaphors as truths is very important. Then we are able to actually learn from the wisdoms of all societies, you know. It's like, remember this Life of Pi? Do you watch the Life of Pi? Yeah. So initially, you know, there's a tiger, and then the Japanese investigator was trying to ask actually what happened, and he told this whole story, fantastic story, the tiger and all that magical stuff that happened. And then the Japanese investigators said, "Come on, tell us what really happened." Right? And then he thought about it and said, "Okay, actually," then he told a different story. Actually, it's the same story, but the tiger was actually the cook or one character, but without all the imageries and representation. And then he asked the investigators, which story do you prefer? Actually, it's the same story. It's just one is told in this way, the other one is told in non-fantastic way, but that's how humans actually become humans, when we tell stories. And the more stories we hear, the better we are in terms of making sense of our common humanity and the interconnectedness that we're talking about.
Yeah, no, I've recently been following like Carl Jung's work, and his, I love how he actually approaches myth and religion. There are these powerful forces inside this human psyche, and in order to actually have any kind of tangible hold on it, we really need to manifest it in very colorful and visible stories, and and that's how we actually approach these powerful forces that drive us, right?
Yeah. And modern society, despite how scientific, modern, where we create our own modern myths. Yeah.
So I'd like to slowly draw this conversation to close. I know we can go on for hours.
I told you 3 hours not enough.
I mean, this kind of feels like a good stopping point.
It is.
I don't know if you
It is
have
great. Yeah,
anything you wanted to add, or Imran, any closing thoughts.
I think I've said a lot. Not sure, maybe Santosh.
No, I'm just I'm in awe. I'm like very blessed just to be in this space. I don't know how to describe this overwhelming sense of peace and connection I'm feeling, and I feel so belong. Like I feel this sense of belonging in this shared space that we've created. It's very sacred for me, and I'm very grateful. There's a beautiful sacredness to this space. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
I just am in like awe and gratitude, like deep gratitude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, similar for me. I really enjoy the conversation. I think it's an authentic space, and we seldom get this. A lot of spaces I've been to are so curated that I mean, today shows that the conversation just flow because we speak from the heart, and there's no pretensions about what we are speaking, and we all come with our own experiences, and we are here to learn from each other's stories, and that's something I'm appreciative of, and thank you so much for this opportunity. There's a lot of things that you mentioned and you raised also that will get me to think further. And it's a continuous process. So when people say, what are you as this person or that person? I'll say, I'm always in the process of becoming. I don't know what exactly I am until my final breath, then it's completion, But right now, it's always a process of becoming. Even what are you as a Muslim? Say, I don't know. It's always a process of becoming because I'm finite, and I know that I do not know, and therefore in this kind of conversations it helps me to gain a greater clarity, and also to allow me to learn in that process and continuously evolve, and that is something that is scary if I were to be my former fundamentalist self. Say, you are not a real Muslim, because how can Muslims have doubts about this? How can you question this? How can you? But I think questioning is part of being human. And if, from my faith tradition, knowledge is important, it's literally the foundation of the religion, then questioning is the beginning of knowledge. And doubt is the beginning of that sincere search for the truth. And to me, nothing will beat that whole constant reaching out and wanting to discover truth with a capital T. And in that sense, I recognize that I am not that truth with the capital T. Unlike if I were to be a fundamentalist, then I am the embodiment of truth with a capital T. That is the arrogance that I think brought Iblis or the devil down, because this is from the Muslim tradition. The biggest sin of the Iblis or the devil is to say, I am better than him. When God asked the devil to bow before Adam, the new creation, he said, no, why should I bow before Adam? I am better than him. So it's that arrogance that caused the downfall of Iblis in the Muslim tradition. Or there's the metaphor of humans must not be arrogant. We must always be humble. We are a lot of shortcomings, and that is something I try to embody as I search for something that is beyond me. And in that process, I have to learn from as many people, as many communities, from different sources, because that's what makes us human. And I'm thankful again. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with Santosh that, we actually managed to achieve a mood of peace, just through conversation, and I think that's just, amazing. I really liked, just a lot of the different points you brought up about I just wrote it down, like needing the courage to deeply listen, always asking who's not at the table, who do we need to include in the conversation, asking how are we complicit in the things that we complain about, and whose interests are being served. These all really match up with my interest in social justice. But then I also have a deep interest in mystery and transcendence, and we talked about that too. And I think that just grounds it like even deeper. So I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I feel I got a glimpse into how you think and how you approach different topics, and really appreciate it. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.